Before we get started today with the speaker series, I just want to give a brief introduction on the background of our company and a little bit about our speaker as well. So about Glen-Gery Brickworks. Brickworks was formed in 1934, headquartered in Sydney, Australia. It is Australia's largest brick manufacturer. Back in 2018, about 4 years ago, Brickworks acquired American brick manufacturer Glen-Gery, and since then we've done one acquisition per year in the United States. We have 10 design studios across the world, 3 in the United States and 7 in Australia. Philly, Des Moines, New York, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, Hobart, and Baltimore are the 10 that we have currently across the world, and New York Design Studio is the flagship studio of the world. So a little bit about the New York Design Studio. This is the global flagship, as I said before. It's 16,000 square feet across 3 floors. As you could see when you first walk in, we have over 10,000 glass bricks. Those are imported from Venice, Italy. The first floor is for event space, and there's also some chips. You might have seen the drawers over there, so a lot of our products that we have on display, we carry chips as well for architects to take with them for future references for their projects. The second floor, which we're on now, is another showroom, and it's used for bigger event spaces, something like this. We had our grand opening in March. We had over 300 guests, so we can hold over 500 between all 3 floors in the studio. We host over 300 events per year in our design studios annually. These include architectural speaker series, they include lunch and learns. We have a lot of talks where we have architects come here, similar today with Ed Lippman, where they talk about where they get inspiration for their projects and the insights they have for future ones as well. So we love to host events here. We have 2 bars in this studio alone. We do a lot of drinking. We have a great time here in the studio. We learn about brick, so a lot of events here in the studio annually. We have over 700 products here on 5th Ave, including products from 10 US plants. We also import brick from Italy, Germany, Australia, and other countries as well. So we do have all of our products here on display in the drawers behind me and to my left. So please feel free to take a look inside those drawers and see what we got going on over here. Just a little video about the design studio. This is our promotional video that was recorded a few months ago back here in New York. So I hope you enjoy it.
In one of our most dynamic and ever-evolving cities, a premier design hub that boasts some of the most diverse and iconic architecture in the world, there lives a space with a presence all its own, as fashion-forward as the city that surrounds it. Built by Brickworks, our global flagship design studio on 5th Avenue. A space spanning over 16,000 square feet, dedicated to elevating brick as a vital, compelling style statement, and bringing an entire community of architects, designers, developers, builders, and other key decision makers together to collaborate and perfect projects. Home to a curated selection of 600 globally sourced luxury building materials and premium products from Glen-Gery, a brand of Brickworks. Equipped with a state-of-the-art broadcast studio and opportunities to connect, learn, and explore brick's full design potential through live-streamed product launches and educational speaker events featuring world-renowned industry leaders. Staffed by product experts who consult one-on-one in our selection center to match the right color, texture, and aesthetic to individual visions. Here is a resource to help you discover the beauty of brick in every variation and arrive at the perfect look to make your next creation a true standout. Striking, substantial, individual. A true presence in the fashion center of the city that's seen it all. This is brick as you've never experienced it before. The Brickworks Design Studio on 5th Avenue.
I'd now like to invite up our Business Development Manager, JP Lippman, to give you a little bit of background information on our speaker tonight, Ed Lippman. So JP, if you please come up. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our beautiful design studio. If this is your first time, ask one of us. Bev is in the back, John, or myself for a tour at the end. Thank you again for joining us for our International Speaker Series event. So we host these speaker series once a month, so do check out our events calendar for future events. About our speaker, with 35 years of experience, Ed Lippman graduated with honors from the University of New South Wales, following a year here in New York City with at the Bauhaus Master Marcel Breuer's office in New York. He did his thesis on the significance of technology in contemporary architecture, and it informed his approach on how he designed. His practice was established in 1985, and during those enduring decades, a range of residential, commercial, public, and industrial projects he's worked on. In recent years, many of these projects have interfaced with the public realm. Lippmann's concerns for urbanity and the shapes of city and environmental sustainability have given rise to many books, publications, and a radio series he hosts in Sydney. Please help me welcome Ed Lippman.
Thanks very much, JP. It's very nice to be here, to be invited by Brickworks to come and give a talk in New York. Who wouldn't want to be here? Sydney is a long way from the northern hemisphere and from New York. And I first came here, luckily, as a 15-year-old accompanying my mother, which was a great opportunity to experience the scale of a city like this. And that led to my return here after studying in the University of New South Wales in Sydney to get the opportunity to work in Marcel Breuer's office in New York. And as I was just saying earlier, that at that time in 1979, when architects were becoming very preoccupied with postmodernism, reversion to historicism, modern architecture was not the fashion of the day. So when I returned to Australia, I was very much out of step with the prevailing sentiment at the time. But I looked for a contemporary modern architecture, something that would inform my approach to design, and I discovered that's me as a 21-year-old in Madison Avenue, up the street from here. And this is the building that I worked on, which was a cigarette factory for Philip Morris in North Carolina. And that was a great experience, but what I was looking for was a modern or a contemporary extension of modernism. And that led me to Buckminster Fuller, to the work of Piano and Rogers and Foster, who were not as well known then as they are now. And that then led me to the idea of lightweight architecture. So when I went back to Australia, I started a practice not long after graduating from university, and initially was commissioned to design houses. This is one of them, which is a humble residential building in a beautiful natural environment near the Pacific coast. And there was a lightweight structure elevating the building above the ground, which was very important for the climate. A high degree of rainfall in this part of Australia, and therefore the building had to be elevated so that the rainwater could run underneath it. As you can see, the concept of system building, of repetitive prefabrication was something that I pursued because I thought that it had a relevance, which you'll see later, to building economically and environmentally. So this was a steel frame building elevated above the ground, clad in plywood. Almost all the components are fabricated off-site, and there's a certain transparency to the architecture, which I think is very suitable for the climate that we have. Oops. I've also been commissioned to do work. This is a house in California in the Sonoma Valley. So after a while, and some of these projects were being published, I was commissioned by people from other parts of the world, and this particular client in San Francisco had another spectacular property in the Sonoma Valley, up in the mountains, and we designed what I guess you could see as a connection to the case study houses, which was also a Californian, has Californian roots. And so these were all projects which explored this sense of transparency, of connection to nature. And although sustainability wasn't front of mind at that time, these are all issues that became very relevant to the work that architects now are involved with. This was another house designed by me with the client, who was a structural engineer from Ovarup. Tristram Carfrae is a well-known structural engineer who designed things like the water cube. He's currently refurbishing and rebuilding the Gaudi's church in Barcelona. But this was his house in Sydney, and as you can see, it's in the national park, facing north, which is the sunny side of the sunny aspect, and it's a building that reaches out into the landscape, and there's a casual quality to these kinds of houses. They look to the north. The views are to the north. The landscape is natural. It's indigenous. The landscape designer who was employed on this project is well known in Australia for harnessing indigenous planting and natural vegetation. So, although this house is not far from the centre of Sydney, it has a quality of being very much part of the natural environment. So working in the city, though, and that's where we're eventually coming to, is a very different thing. Sydney is blessed with a wonderful natural environment, thankfully, because arguably the built environment hasn't been as complementary to its setting as it could be. But the city faces east to the Pacific Ocean. You can see here the cliff, which is a stunning backdrop. The eastern edge of the city is just cut into a sandstone cliff. And there's a view to the harbour from the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and also a view to the ocean. Apart from the sort of rectilinear architecture that I was interested in pursuing, which allowed this kind of system building and prefabrication, there were also some quite eccentric clients roaming around Sydney who've got a certain degree of affluence. This was a project which was commissioned by one of these such property developers, actually. He was a Chinese businessman who told me that he wanted a house with no corners, no straight lines, and the Chinese feng shui, the belief that the energy needs to flow through a space and not be trapped. So, not really believing that this was a possibility, I set about to design a curved building, not thinking that he would actually build it, but exploring this idea of curved geometry. So you can see that it's a figure eight. The eastern side on the right faces, gets the morning sun, so the bedrooms are on the eastern side of the house. The living rooms, which have the view of the harbour, to the west. And so there was a logic behind it all, and you can see this is the view from the living room, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Opera House, which you all know about is not quite visible, but on the strength of these sketches, he then commissioned this house to be built. This was a model. Of course, projects like this raised the ire of the local councils, and there was some controversy about whether this should get planning consent and a building certificate, but eventually it did, and much to the amazement of the locals, was eventually built, and has become something of an icon in Sydney. That's the view, the real view from the living room. Very much like the sketch, but even though the geometry is somewhat different to the earlier projects, there's a certain fluidity which this house provides, and I guess it was actually sold during construction to another client who ended up completing the house, and has become very well known part of the Sydney urban environment. It's concrete, so it has more thermal mass than the other projects, but it's a steel frame, and the glazing is also positioned to allow views to the west, sun and warmth from the north, and also a natural ventilation system which allows cool air to rise up through the building and out through the roof terrace. You can see at the top of the stair there's a louvered venturi that actually allows hot air to escape. So there was a history of residential architecture. By this stage, I was commissioned to do some more public work, and I guess working at a different scale provided greater opportunities. This, as you can see, is a site very close to the Harbour Bridge in the oldest part of Sydney, known as the Rocks, the most historic part of Sydney, which is full of sandstone terrace houses. And this project, which was a community centre, sits on a very narrow slither of space abutting the expressway which leads to the Harbour Bridge. And what was very important was that the views from the expressway to the city had to be maintained. The council were very, very strict about that. And in our view, it was very important to maintain some degree of streetscape. So the sketches indicate that's a view from the street looking at the building. Although it needed to be a certain height because it was used for basketball and netball and sports facility, it also, in our view, needed to have a scale which was sympathetic to its context. So you can see the cross-section of this building from the street, which is on the left. It looks like a two-storey building, which is sympathetic to the rest of the street, but it's actually quite high, and it allows cool air coming in at low level to be exhausted up through the roof and out through the top. So it's an unair-conditioned building, which is very pleasant to be in, and even if it's not windy, the stack effect allows hot air to be drawn through it. That's a sketch of what the building looks like from the street. You can see that it's glazed at street level because there's a mural, which you'll see in a minute, on the wall, which was part of the brief. The council insisted that the community mural on the edge of the expressway had to be visible from the street. And that I thought was a pretty tall order, but the glass shop front that allows transparency through the building provided that view. And you can see that even at night, when the building's lit from inside, passers-by get the opportunity to see the mural inside the building. Once again, this building raised some eyebrows because of its historic context. It's not a sandstone building. it doesn't look like the 19th century buildings in the street or in the neighbourhood. However, it was eventually approved and has once again become a popular building, but one which is much loved by the community and the city workers who use it to exercise in. And it's also become part of the local heritage. Over time, this is another issue that I'm quite interested in. Over time, buildings change. So this is a picture which was taken recently when a new layer of public art was brought in. A local artist, younger artist, a city in Sydney, like you have here in New York, has a program of including public art in any major project, and which is an opportunity for young artists and established artists to display their work. So this is, I think, a very important thing for buildings to keep changing over time and enhancing them. That's a book that was written about the work of the practice, and I've got some here tonight if anyone's interested in having a look. But by this stage, the work now was becoming far more centred on public architecture and urban design. This was a project which was a competition in 1998 for a new swimming pool on a fabulous site over the harbour of Sydney, a very unique site. We won the competition, you can see, my associate and I. I'm the guy not wearing the suit. But we won this project, and it was very significant because it's one of the only pools in Sydney which has salt water. It's built over the harbour, and historically it had been an Aboriginal swimming hole for centuries. And so there was a historic layer which existed before we came along. This pool actually replaced a previous one. World records have been broken there. And interestingly, it's located very much as part of the landscape environment. There's the Botanic Gardens, which is a much loved part of Sydney. You can see it's part of the Botanic Gardens, but it's also a stone's throw from the downtown Sydney. So, and people again come to use the pool either at lunchtime or after work. So it's a very popular place. The project for us was very important because it had to straddle this idea of being on land and on water. And it's both. So there was a certain sensitivity to the way one treats buildings like that. It doesn't sit in the ground, it's elevated, it's off the ground. Obviously the part of the pool which is over the water had to be supported by piles, and the whole experience of using this building or being in it or seeing it was one that we thought had to be handled sensitively. It's a very simple plan, as you can see. It's a long, lean development. There is no air conditioning at all. Most of the building's outdoors, but even the building itself is naturally ventilated, and we want to create an experience of a very enjoyable and a very good relationship to the context. The view on entry is to see across through the building and across to the other side of the harbour. So the building itself doesn't really impose itself, but more provides an opportunity for shade and for using the pools themselves. These are some of the sketches. The change rooms, which are behind these metal louvers, allow, again, fresh air to blow through them. Privacy, of course, was an important consideration, so that you can't actually see into the change room, but you can see down to the water below the building. This is a social space on the top floor, which is used for yoga and for meetings or receptions. And once again, one feels very much part of the environment. That's the change room. At the time, this is now 20 years old, but at the time when this was built, I felt that most municipal pools are air-conditioned, dark spaces without any windows. This was very different. So there was a certain sense of delight, a certain sense of pleasure about using the building. And the detailing was obviously quite a painstaking process. The cafe on the top floor, which overlooks the harbour and the pools. This can be used by people who aren't necessarily wanting to swim in the building, but just want to walk around to the end of the point to enjoy the harbour. And that's the building when it was completed. Designing swimming pools became something of an expertise. It became something that we were suddenly branded with as being specialists at, which is not necessarily the case. But this was another pool that was commissioned by a school, and their brief was that they wanted a water polo pool and a learn to swim pool, two separate swimming pools, but what we did was to combine the two pools into a single body of water, a 33-metre pool plus a 15-metre pool. We created a 50-metre pool which did both, and that was a very good investment for this school. You can see that the school encompasses architecture which goes back many years. European settlement in Australia is not as old as it is in other parts of the world, but this school's about 120 years old, and we thought that the prospect of adding new building stock needed to respect the old. So we established certain rules about how the new related to the old, and there's no problem with new architecture, but there should be some relationship between older buildings and newer buildings. And often that's to do with vistas between them, not blocking views between old and new buildings, and the relationship between the siting of the old and the new. Once again, the opportunity of natural light and natural ventilation was extracted to the fullest. You can see that the building is open to the north, which is the sunny side in the southern hemisphere, and sun comes in from there. It can bounce off light-coloured surfaces, so the building doesn't need to be artificially lit. Also, cool air at low level, rising, and extracting hot air can be employed. These are themes that were repeatedly used before. And once again, the pool's a very casual, well-lit environment. There's a 4-metre truss, which is also a skylight, which spans the full length of the building, and that allows this juxtaposition of scale internally, and also the use of natural light to enter the building. This also wrapped around a gym, and once again, I think as architects, we need to think very carefully about how we adapt old and new, and that we don't necessarily demolish old buildings, but we can somehow adapt old buildings. So to the left here is an old gym, which the school wanted to demolish, but which we were able to incorporate into the new development. You can see, as the sketch showed, that this building, Schofield House, that we didn't think it was appropriate to build in front of that building. So there was a clear line drawn from day one as a principle that we shouldn't encroach on that, and we should respect the fact that there's some fine old architecture which should be appreciated. So from there, there was other work to do at this school, and I'm sure the situation in America is very much the same, but in Sydney in particular, which we'll talk about later as a global city, there's a huge pressure on private schools to provide better facilities and more innovative facilities. So we had a client here who was a very forward-thinking school principal, and she sent me to a place called Reggio Emilia, which is in northern Italy, where we started to understand how children learn and the whole philosophy of educating young minds to think. And although this is common parlance in educational circles, there are very few school principals who would actually entertain the idea of an open plan environment. We looked at the work of Richard Neutra, who had done similar things in California, the Corona School in California, but she wanted to build a school where there were no walls separating children. And the concept of classrooms, we changed the word classroom to studio. And you can see here that, and of course her management board were quite concerned about that, but we created rooms that could be subdivided if they had to be, or they haven't had to be, but learning spaces which look to the outside of the building, as well as outdoor learning spaces where children could lie under a tree with laptops and learn in a natural setting. And then this is a sketch of, the other idea, of course, of schools is that they're miniature cities. They're cities for small people. And there's what we call a piazza in the middle of the building, which provides space for outdoor learning. It's a place where people who arrive can congregate and have a coffee, parents who drop their children off. And then there are smaller spaces and more intimate spaces. And this idea of different scales within a building, which for children is very important because it provides them with an introduction to what the world outside is like. There's a lot of learning that takes place outside, not inside. There are different opportunities that exist for internal spaces, but this idea of seamlessness, this facade can be completely opened up so that the internal space can become external space. And most times of the year, in that climate, that's quite possible to do. It's a 3-storey building, so there's a car park at the ground level and vertical circulation, and what became a theme of the practice is to make that a delightful experience. Moving up and down a building, moving horizontally through a building and vertically becomes something enjoyable. There are more intimate spaces where children working in groups will have to go, as well as larger spaces where they can do other things. But this variety of space within the school was very important. And of course the use of colour. We called it a sensory-rich environment. So in the studies that I had done at Reggio Emilia, the town in Italy, there was certainly this philosophy of providing children with an experience of diversity. Within the space, of course, children are encouraged and teachers to create their own environment. And of course, there was a lot of difficulty for the old staff at the school to adapt to the new building. And a lot of the teachers left. Some new teachers were employed, but it demanded of them a very rigorous and very different approach to teaching. You can see some of the walls are there in these pictures. These are the smaller spaces. That's on the bottom left of the teachers' hubs, the entrance to the school on the top, and the bathrooms for the children. So, going from a city for little people to a city for big people, this is Sydney, the western edge of Sydney as it is today. And at the top, how it was in the early 1800s. And this was a large project on the western edge of the city, which was a competition. Many hundred or so architects and urban designers took part in this competition. It was known as East Darling Harbour, now called Barangaroo. But it was a major redevelopment of what was previously a shipping terminal on the edge of the city and turning it into space for people to work, live and play. And we looked at the nature of Sydney, the history of Sydney, and the way that people live today and the way that cities are shaped today. So Sydney has become, since the time that I was born there, in the late 50s, it has now become a global city, what we refer to as a global city. Population of 5 million people, which is not that much in global terms, but it's very well connected with other parts of the world in terms of education, in terms of business and its economy. And the area that I'm talking about is on the right. You can see the ships on the right-hand side. It's that edge of the entire 2 kilometres down to the south. And this was the government initiated a competition to try to find ideas to redevelop that part of the city. And you can see the sort of morphology of building height, the green space, the connection of green space, and the necklace of the harbour edge, the red dashed line. There was a strong view that the harbour edge should be accessible to the public, and it should be a pedestrianised precinct, not a vehicular one. We also started to look at Sydney and its environment. Sydney is actually not one city. It's a number of. It's 5 major urban hubs, and it needs to be developed in that way. This is a diagram which shows the natural environment, as well as the density in different parts of Sydney. And understanding this was very key to understanding what we were proposing for this area of Barangaroo. Transportation, which is another critical thing. Historically, because of the topography of Sydney and the high use of motor cars, our public transport system is not as good as it should be. So we got together with Martha Schwartz from New York, landscape architect, who was a lot of fun to work with. We invited Richard Rogers from London, who worked with us, and you can see some of the people sitting around this table in our office in Sydney. Martha's on the right. Ivan Harbour from the London Rogers office on the right as well, and we really got together to look at what we could do to transform this very tough industrial edge of Sydney to an exemplary standard of living for the future. You can see that a lot of it is green. The big buildings are to the right, and they're embedded in the scale of the city, so that the scale of building gets lower as you get close to the point, to the edge of the harbour. We worked with Arup, who were our other great partner, engineers who we'd all worked with before. And not only were they interested in structural engineering, but they were very much interested in environmental engineering, using the harbour to cool buildings, using the harbour also as transportation. Growing food on the site became a possibility, and also connecting this space to the other parts of Sydney which are endemic to our lifestyle. So Sydney still is, even though the population is expanding and the density is increasing, very much an outdoor city where lifestyle is very important. So it might seem funny, but you can see the guy on the bottom right lying there with what we call a tinny of beer. Not all that sporty as Australians are supposed to be, but he's enjoying the beach and he's having a beer. The beach in the centre there is exactly the same scale as what we were proposing, but this was quite unique because this was a beach in the city, and that's not common. But we thought very plausible, not just for tourists, but also for people who live in the area and for people who work in the area. So this too was somewhat controversial. We didn't win this, we came second, and which was controversial, and I think on reflection, one of the reasons that we didn't win was because we had team members from America, from England. We had a developer on board, Lend-Lease, and the team who won the competition were friends of mine, Australian architectural, a group of Australian architects, and we lost to them, which was controversial at the time, but led to a situation where the whole competition process was eventually abandoned, and in the end the government decided to sell the site, which was sold to the developer who we worked with originally as a competition with Richard Rogers' office in London. And the principles of what has now been built were very much established by this scheme. You can see on the bottom left what was very important was the idea of sustainable building. So it wasn't just developing the site in a way which was sustainable, but also the orientation to sunlight, to rainwater reuse, growing food on the site, using fresh air to ventilate buildings that can breathe and be healthy for people to live in. This is not the real thing, but this was a photo montage of what the building would look like, what the development would look like, with taller structures to the right, the southern end of the site. Also importantly, closer to transport, so that the thousands of people who work in these high-rise towers can actually get in and out of the city very easily, and the rest of the site lower rise and eventually parkland at the end. This led to the publishing of a book, which I've got here tonight if you want to take one, which started to look at the morphology of Sydney as a city, where it's going, and what the shape of the city will be in the future. So we've now hit 5 million people. And the issue in Australia, or in Sydney in particular, is big cities have opportunities. There's vibrance, there's connectivity, there's obviously opportunities in large cities that smaller towns don't have in terms of education, in terms of business, and in terms of interaction with other people. But the question of whether the city is becoming a better place to live, a more enjoyable city to live in, is front of mind. So I believe that it's a question of planning. The big cities are usually better cities if they're well planned. And that has to do with transportation, it has to do with densities, green space, and good buildings, but more so to do with the planning of those precincts. In terms of the natural environment, I think Sydney is second to none. In terms of harbours, there are many great harbour cities. Sydney is certainly one of them. And the big change, though, that is happening in Sydney is that the central downtown, what we call the central business district, which has been predominantly a commercial precinct, is now becoming a living precinct. So the concept of suburbia, I think Sydney grew up very much as an American city with commuters travelling from suburbs into the city. That's changing significantly, and the densities obviously, of high-rise apartment living are changing, which I think is beneficial and important. You can see these are diagrams which were analysed in my book, which look at public transport, distance between major centres, the harbour itself. There's also opportunity for transportation on the harbour. Ferries, much like Venice, are a very good way to travel if you're lucky enough to live near the harbour itself, and main roads. So working then in the centre of the city becomes very important, because we're seeing now, especially with COVID, that buildings which are built for one use are of no enduring value, that the buildings need to adapt. All buildings need to adapt, in fact, but even commercial buildings need to be adaptable to residential buildings and vice versa. But this was a competition that we took part in about 10 years ago now in the centre of the Central Business District. A commercial high-rise building which has a 6-star Green Star sustainability rating, which is the highest level. It's like the LEEDs rating that you use in America, but it's the highest standard of sustainability. But there were 3 essential aspects of this project which were important. Firstly, the sustainability dimension, which the developer was very keen on. Secondly, the interface with the public realm. And thirdly, the internal environment for people to work in. So you can see that, unlike Melbourne, Sydney is not a city that has a predominance of public space. There are some squares, there are some important public spaces in the city, but not many. So what we tried to do is open this up at street level to allow public space to flow underneath. You can see from this diagram that there are, in yellow, a few squares and parks, but there's not a reliance on for developers to create these public spaces. The city is crammed. Sydney has grown up with a developer mentality, where there's been a desire to create maximum floor space, minimum setback to site boundaries, but maximum footprint, floor space, and views. And while that's understandable, we were trying to address that. So you can see that in plan here, the 80% of the site is opened up as public space. There's a square in front of the building, the semicircular area, but our site gets sun in winter and is therefore a more desirable area for pedestrians and the public. So we wanted to create that place for people. And you can see that, the sunshine, the views out upstairs on the upper levels are available. By raising the building up in the air, we also provided the opportunity for views. And we are a bit obsessed with views in Sydney especially, harbour views in particular. So by elevating the first commercial floor of the building, some 20 metres in the air, it meant that the building could be higher and get better views. At street level, we were trying to create a vibrant environment for buskers, for people to sit on the stairs at lunchtime, very much a place for people. And the expression of the tower also reflects that structural system. Inside the building itself, we wanted these office spaces to be as flexible as possible. So every third floor of the building is a full floor, and the 2 interstitial levels in between those full floor plates were mezzanines, and they could be adapted to different tenant requirements, different businesses, different companies. This is an area of Sydney where there are a lot of legal firms and commercial institutions, and they have different requirements. So we wanted to create a space where the concept of individual offices pretty much didn't exist. People could interact with one another and see down and through the building. You can see from these preliminary sketches. This, I should have mentioned, of course, that this project was also done in collaboration with Richard Rogers' office in London. And we probably wouldn't have had the opportunity of doing this project without them, but we brought them into the project when this was another competition, a design excellence competition, and they collaborated with us in that. But you can see that the environment inside these office spaces is what we call very democratic. In fact, the experience after the project was finished was that the companies who were attracted to the building were ones who didn't want, even large legal firms, they changed their whole modus operandi and gave up the idea of individual private offices for hot desking or open plan office space. They have separate rooms, meeting rooms, but not individual offices, even partners of law firms. We proposed a restaurant on the roof so that we were once again duplicating the idea of public space at ground level with public space at roof level. Unfortunately, for commercial reasons, this never happened, but instead we did other things with the roof, which I'll show you later. These were some of the ideas of how you would incorporate air conditioning and lighting into the structure of the building. So these are all ideas that Arup, Rogers and my practice have been exploring for many years, the full integration of building services, structure and construction. How do you deal with the environment? How do you deal with the sun, glare, without relying on heavily tinted glazing or high-performance glass? So the glass in this building is pretty much clear, but it's shaded externally, and the external shading also provides a platform for glass cleaners to attend to the exterior of the building. So it's not a sheer glass curtain wall box, but one that responds to its environment. The roof terraces, you can see at mid-level, halfway up the building and also on the top of the building, are accessible. And by using windscreens judiciously placed, they become quite usable spaces. And in fact, we found that a lot of the people who work in the building were using these roof terraces to conduct business, to have meetings, to have lunch, to meet with one another. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the views from up there are pretty spectacular, but they're also just very pleasant spaces to be in. Constructing a building like this was very interesting for us. And, you know, coming from my experience with Breuer and this, the Bauhaus idea of prefabrication, I think we've now today all over the world building buildings which are manufactured from parts that come from all other parts of the globe. So the steel was from China, the curtain wall came from Thailand, some of the glass came from Germany, and all that was happening really was assembling on the site in Sydney. And of course there are some issues with that, because sometimes the tolerances aren't quite right and things don't fit together as well as they could, but we're getting pretty good at that these days. And also this permits high-speed construction. So buildings like this, churches in the past which might have taken generations to be realised, can be done in almost no time. This is the glass lobby box at street level. So while we were trying, and as I mentioned earlier, the sustainability was another key aspect. So the three important points were the extension of the public realm at street level, which was our small contribution to the urbanity of the city. The internal work environment, the second major point, and thirdly, sustainability. This is a 20,000 square metre office tower with 36 car spaces, blackwater treatment plant, low performance glass with external sun shading, and was actually exporting treated grey water to other buildings when it was first completed. The public art in this project was also an important dimension. Jenny Holzer from New York, who won the competition to install the public art, which is a scrolling text of Aboriginal stories. So if pedestrians and passers-by are that interested, they'll actually read a whole story which repeats itself every 7 to 10 years, but has an interesting story of local indigenous history. These now, a couple of more recent projects just to wrap up. This is a building recently completed. It's an extension to a synagogue where, once again, the building on the left is historic. I use that word in the context I come from. This is only 50, 60 years old, but it's an old heritage listed building. And on the right is the extension, another sanctuary which is plugged onto the side of it. And clearly the two buildings are of a different era, different materials, different architectural expression, but they do work together. So while the heritage listed building to the left I describe as the granddaddy, hopefully in time the one on the right may have some, also be considered to be of historic merit. You can see that it's a lightweight roof with glass around the perimeter, allowing natural light and air to come through it on a masonry base of concrete. Once again, these themes of natural ventilation, natural illumination are at work here, and I think provide a very good environment for people to be in. Of course, a building like this with 1,000 people, which is also, I should say, used for other purposes other than a religious sanctuary. It's used as a communal space for other organisations. Has to be air conditioned, has to provide AV performance requirements. So there's a lot of technology in the building, however, we're not relying on it. The way that this building is constructed was also very important. Single span building, sits on triangulated columns. We found that the structure was designed for maximum efficiency, but in the process of developing that structure, we also found that the iconography of the Star of David started to intrude into the actual structure of the building, and you'll see that in a minute. So once again, this building had to be fully prefabricated off-site and brought together in pieces, assembled very quickly. The structure is rational, but it's also iconographic. So this is a diagram of the ceiling, and you can see that there are triangulated beams which span across the building, which are strong and rigid, and then in between that there are plywood ceiling panels, and underlying that is this triangulation Star of David motif. And we, explained that to the client, that this was actually something that you don't need to stick things on the windows, but there's something embedded in the design of the building which has some relevance. I was also commissioned to do an artwork which I'd never done before, and the plan I thought was to invite an artist to do some work, and I'd been speaking to Lynn Utzon, who's the daughter of Jorn Utzon, who's owned the Opera House. She lives in Mallorca but comes to Australia quite regularly. Unfortunately, the client didn't want to invest in her services, so we ended up doing it with a graphic artist and working again on the theme of the triangulation, going back to the Star of David, and the narrative was that this window should be the tree of life, and there are 7 different fruits, different colours for different fruits, but it was an abstraction of the narrative. But importantly, was something which was integral with the building itself, integral with the architecture. And that's the front facade. There are also these lanterns in the building which bring light over the reader's desk and punctuate that space. So this building, interestingly, recently won a Heritage Award because of the way it addressed the old building. And so I think for a practice that's now, some 30, 40 years old, these things are very important. What happens to buildings over time? How are they adapted to change, and how do they actually relate to older buildings? That's the building in use. It's very well managed because, as I said before, it's not used only for religious events, but it's also used for concerts. Members of the community who are not members of the congregation can use this space. And I also think this is the future of architecture. The buildings need to be multi-purposed and have multiple users. Very important. So just to finish up, because I was invited by Brickworks to come and speak to you today, and none of these projects use bricks. So I have a couple of brick projects. The first one is a building which just won an award in Sydney, 2 awards in fact, last week. One was the Lord Mayor's Award. This was a project, quite a large urban design project in Sydney which involved 6 different practices. So mine was one of them. But importantly, it was the connection between the buildings which was as important, or which was awarded, not the buildings themselves, but the spaces that we actually carved between the buildings. My building was this adaptive reuse of an old historic sandstone building, which again had been changed many times over the years. And some of the other architects who did the other buildings, they should be talking here because they did great work with bricks. And I'm sure, in fact, they come from Brickworks, no doubt. But as much as architects like myself like to design new buildings, there is a very good case, both environmentally, historically and socially, for old buildings to be adapted to new uses. And in cities now, of course, that's a very exciting thing. So you can see that there is an interpretation of what was there before. There's also a very clear articulation of what's new. We're not trying to, make believe that we're designing old things. There are modern elements in old buildings, but they can work with the old fabric. And of course, this is only a cold shell. Soon it'll be fitted out as a vibrant series of restaurants. And this is another project which is not yet built, very close to the other one, in the centre of Sydney. You can see the Opera House. And this is a building, sorry, I don't know how to go back, but it's a 5-storey building, a 5-storey stone building. Here we go. Okay, there's a 5-storey stone building, and it's called the Royal Automobile Club. It's a place for what until recently has been for some group of, old-fashioned gentlemen, no women allowed. Now they allow women, of course, but for many years it's been a place for men with fancy cars. They can't maintain the building because they don't generate enough money to do that. So they need to build something on top of this building in order to generate the revenue to maintain it and to restore it. So there have been various attempts to do that over the years. This is an old one where there's an Italian palazzo placed on top. That wasn't built. We had a look at it and said, well, we didn't think it was appropriate to try to mimic the architecture of what was below, but to actually put something on top of the building which was clearly expressed and articulated as new architecture of its time, but somehow sitting above it. So you can see the old building is the lower 5 stories. There's a new lift shaft and a box on top, which is essentially glass. It had to sit on the structural grid of the existing building. So there was a triangulated structure, steel structure, much like the first project I showed you, the house, where the loads are transferred back onto the existing building structure, and a lot of work has to be done to the old part of the building to make it structurally sound. And then on top of that sits this new commercial space, which will create the revenue to keep the building alive. And of course, there are studies indicating how the old fabric can be retained. Some of it can't be. Some of it's surgical, but parts of the old building have to be modified. And in the end, this is a concept, really. I wouldn't say it's detailed design, but we had some difficulty with the heritage lobby in getting this approved because, well, we argued it was respectful to the old building because it's clearly separated, but it's in a part of it's in a street in Sydney, Macquarie Street, which has a long history, and we're still arguing the case. So, while I think there's an importance for historic continuity in architecture and in society in general, there are other views on that, and we don't always win. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have a question for you. You have a superb body of work that's progressed over many years. You opened your talk with a picture of Mr. Fuller, one of his 10th-century structures. And clearly that's very minded, area, and strong. And that's been, to me, at least it appears to me, that's very much part of your work as well. But it's changed over the years. Can you talk a bit about the relationship between design, structure, and weight as it's changed in your work over the years?
Well, famously, Buckminster Fuller said, "How much does your building weigh?" And I think that's been something that I think good design, and even these days when we talk about sustainability and the use of materials, what materials we should use, that less is more. That if you can do something well using less material, that is good design. Of course, buildings need to perform well as well. So, a Miesian box is almost impossible to build in Australia because of the thermal requirements and the legislation for doing that. So, masonry buildings, brick buildings, concrete buildings have a thermal mass. I guess I've become a bit less obsessed with, the Buckminster Fuller ideograms I think are wonderful. And I think what he was talking about, he was probably the first environmentalist really, but I think there are many, in terms of building in cities, there are so many issues that we're contending with that you know, we're not dealing with a tabula rasa. Adaptive reuse of buildings, I think, is a very valid way of keeping cities alive, and therefore, you know, we inherit old building fabric, and we should and we do reuse them. So I think there's a place for everything, but you know, cities are all about continuity. So putting the dome, that photo that I showed was an idea of creating an unpolluted New York City, which in the 50s or whenever he said that was a very radical idea, but it was actually, I think he was educating us. Nothing else?
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Ed, for such a great presentation. And your projects are beautiful. We'd love to see the beach, as a beach lover, love to see that concept come to life pretty soon. Again, there are copies of Ed's book in the back, so if you're interested, please pick up a copy. We do have our wait staff that's going to be coming out. Again, with some canapes, and the bar will be open. So, and if you have any questions, Ed will be around for discussion. And our team also, John and I and Bev, if you want a tour of the studio or want to talk about any upcoming projects, let us know. Thank you.